Hey, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to give it maybe a couple minutes to make sure everybody that signed up can get in here. We have about 35 registrants, so we'll see. We're about halfway there now. Chuck, looks like we have about 14. Do you want to just kind of get into it? Start with the agenda?
Yeah,
Cool.
sounds great.
Awesome. Well, all right. First, thanks everybody for attending this. Really, this is one of a series of webinars that we're going to do here on the East Silverfort team, starting with this spotlight. So today we're going to talk about Silverfort and Yubikey, how you can safeguard your organization with phishing-resistant MFA. We'll take a look at the agenda here. So just to start with intros, I'm Evan. I'm the Mid-Atlantic Regional Sales Manager here at Silverfort. Joined today by Chuck. Chuck, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, good afternoon, Chuck McAllister, Senior Sales Engineer working with Evan and the America's East team.
Awesome. So here's the agenda today for this webinar. We've got about 30 minutes, maybe a little less, to kind of cover some of these different topics here. So really, we're going to start with just a discussion on kind of the background of this conversation here. Really take a look at some of those federal mandates like Executive Order 14028, establishing zero trust, MFA, a couple other federal guidance items, who's impacted by the executive order, and kind of those trickle-down effects into kind of private industry. We're going to take a look at Yubikey itself as a phishing-resistant MFA according to NIST standards, and then get into a live demo Chuck's going to run on applying Yubikey's MFA to a variety of on-premise Active Directory authentications, including PowerShell, a couple others, and then we'll do a Q&A. Just a quick housekeeping note, we will have the chat running, so if anybody has questions along the way, please put them in. We'll try and stop and check those questions out. At the end, like I mentioned, we do have the Q&A session, so we might be able to answer them there. But if we don't have time to get to them before that 12:30 hits, we'll be able to follow up with you over email. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So really, just to set the stage for this conversation today, on May 12, 2021, the Biden administration issued Executive Order 14028, improving the nation's cybersecurity. Really, the discussion item we're going to be looking at today is that mandate that they gave to adopt zero trust frameworks within 60 days and MFA within 180 days of issuance of that order. We're going to talk about more so the phishing-resistant MFA, which is mandated by fiscal year 2024. Also, Office of Management and Budget's Zero Trust Strategy memo issued a little bit later in 2022, setting that baseline for access controls and the move towards zero trust strategy. And then finally, the White House statement issued March 21st, 2022, really kind of extending more out to the the private sector, urging that second factor, that multi-factor authentication for critical infrastructure. This is really kind of motivated by the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident that occurred. So just to pause for a second and talk, who's actually affected or impacted by Executive Order 14028? So obviously, this is a federal government mandate focused on the federal government. So really looking at, you can see here, who's directly impacted: government civilian employees at very first, contractors, as well as civilian partners, trickling out to Department of Defense, the intel community, the defense industrial base, some of those enabling services like government critical ICAM systems, cloud services as well. And then really we do see these sort of federal mandates, regulations, requirements trickling down into the private sector. So particularly regulated industries like healthcare, financial services, education, SLED, and then out to some of those larger private sector organizations, enterprises, even consumers. Really, that kind of follows the trend we saw with frameworks like NIST, where a federal mandate suddenly became kind of the adopted standard. There are additional federal mandates that cover kind of zero trust, MFA, piece as well. We're not going to get into them, but if you're interested in taking a look at some of these different requirements, there's a couple of different memos, the order, zero trust strategy, and FIPS 201-3. Chuck,
Yes.
I'll turn the part over to you.
Yeah, great. So let's talk about the requirement for phishing-resistant MFA and what that actually is. And I'm going to totally cheat. I'm going to steal the right out of NIST 800-63B-4, which is the latest public draft of the new version coming out. And it really says that phishing resistance is the ability for the authentication protocol itself to detect and prevent disclosure of the authentication secret without reliance on the vigilance of the subscriber. So really, what does that mean in English? It means that the user cannot be tricked into giving up that secret. Think about it, things like your password or an OTP, they can be stolen, they can be social engineered, and even push notifications can be social engineered or stolen through proxies like Evil Engine X, which allow people to steal that and reuse that. And of course, FIDO and Smart Card are the only phishing-resistant MFA available. Sorry, I went on mute there for a second. So why is a YubiKey phishing-resistant? Well, it's a couple things. One, the most important is really based on the crypto that's being used. When we're talking about shared secrets, that's symmetric. I need to know it, and the server needs to know about it. Think about your password. But when we're talking about FIDO, we're talking about asymmetric or public key cryptography. Anytime I'm registering a YubiKey with a service, I'm creating a unique public and private key pair. That private key, most importantly, never ever leaves the YubiKey, and the public key goes to the service. Yubico, Silverfort, Google, any of the services that you're going to access. Another important part is the concept of origin-bound keys, where the YubiKey will only respond to a cryptographic challenge from the URL that it registered from. And lastly, and really, really important, is that concept of no shared secrets. Since we're creating that public and private key pair for each individual service, when I'm registering a YubiKey with Silverfort, it's only the public key that we receive. And this way, if we are ever compromised, the integrity of the YubiKey is not compromised because it's not a shared secret. And of course, this needs to work everywhere. So there's native support across all browsers and operating systems. And then just a quick look at the journey of FIDO. It's kind of crazy. It's already been 10 years since FIDO's really been introduced, and it got picked up initially by Google. So we were able to get that strong MFA for all of our Google pieces. And we saw it being picked up by GitHub and Salesforce and browsers like Firefox. And then we start seeing broader adoption. NIST now recognizing that U2F or FIDO is a authentication AL3, meaning it's the highest level of assurance for the authenticator. And then from there, Microsoft launches the latest version, FIDO 2 for passwordless. We see the executive order we talked about previously, 14028, mandating phishing-resistant MFA. And then finally, CISA, saying that FIDO is the gold standard for MFA.
So we'll pivot here for just a second to kind of talk about how does Silverfort fit into this mix. So really what Silverfort's going to do is combine YubiKey's modern phishing resistance with legacy application protection. So we're going to be able to extend YubiKey's phishing resistant MFA to any of the sensitive resources one might have from their legacy stack, including ones that couldn't be protected before. Very specifically, we're going to look at what we call the MFA blind spot. So there's still many sensitive resources that organizations have in their environment that rely on their legacy protocols, legacy identity access management infrastructure like on-premise Active Directory that don't support MFA. So with Silverfort, what we can do is extend YubiKey's MFA to things like command line tools. So think psexec, PowerShell, SSH, RDP, run as, WMI. We can put it on admin consoles like vCenter, Hyperdrive. file systems like CIFS, SQL, legacy applications, so homegrown third-party apps that you might have, network devices, OT, and even air-gapped systems. Why that's important, why it's important to kind of solve this MFA blind spot, really, and you can see on the pattern at the bottom, 82% of attacks, ransomware attacks specifically, exploit this identity security gap to spread. And as a result, cyber insurance requirements and federal regulations like Executive Order 14028 are requiring MFA for that very reason, to address that concern. We're going to get into the architecture side of how exactly we do what we do. I'm going to turn this over to Chuck, though, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Great, thanks, Evan. So let me just share my screen. I'm going to talk about the architecture, how all this really works, and then from there, get into the demo itself. So everything we're doing here at Silverfort is under that lens of authentication. So as a user or a service account attempts to access a resource, maybe me as a domain admin, I'm trying to do a PowerShell to one of my servers. Well, the first stop really is hitting Active Directory. The domain controller needs to verify that first factor, username and password. At that point, we're going to pause authentication, and we're going to send that request to Silverfort for a second opinion. Now, Silverfort's running as a virtual appliance in the environment. We're receiving that communication through an adapter on the domain controller, whose only job is to pause authentication and send it to us. Now, Silverfort's going to look at the message, analyze it, and apply policy. And really, for users, we're talking about one of three things. It's allow, deny, or MFA. Now, we can send this off to a variety of authenticators, but in this case, we're talking about YubiKeys. So as I attempt to PowerShell over to my server, I get a pop-up on my desktop. I'm going to press my YubiKey. I'm going to give that strong phishing-resistant MFA. Once that challenge has been accepted, I release that back to Active Directory. Authentication occurs as normal. And of course, we have an audit trail. And this audit trail could be stored completely within Silverfort. But more importantly, we don't want that data in an island. So we're going to send that off to your SIM so you have all the authentication across the environments in that single pane of glass. So let me drop out of PowerShell and get to the demo itself. So in this case, I'm going to walk through 4 different use cases, starting with the really basic and getting a bit more fun. So I always like starting off talking about things that are built into the operating system, things that we generally consider unprotectable. And one of the most basic examples is a file share. Attempt to get to my file share. I get prompted there in the bottom right, completely customized notification. I'm simply saying, Chuck, are you trying to access this file share? By hitting authenticate, we're going to bring up the browser, gives us that FIDO experience. And in this case, I'm only choosing for user presence or simply touching my key. Now, if your YubiKey is already using UV or user verification, PIN or a biometric, you can also support that as well. To get a bit more interesting, one of my favorite use cases is a YubiKey as a second factor to PowerShell. And of course, this could be any command line tool, but as an easy example, I'm just going to run a PowerShell, and all I'm doing is connecting to my remote app server and executing a few commands. From here, once again, I'm getting that prompt saying, Chuck, are you trying to access PowerShell from this computer? Why, yes, I am. Once again, being prompted for my YubiKey. Go ahead and touch that. I get access. It runs the application, and I have that full audit trail as well. Looking at RDP, of course, RDP could be tackled in a bunch of different ways. Traditional MFA can do this, but in many cases, we're talking about agents to handle that authentication. So in this case, I'm simply authenticating to Active Directory. I'm capturing the authentication, which means I don't need additional agents for this to happen. So once again, authenticate, touch my YubiKey, and I'll get my access to RDP. And we can see I get that access. And then lastly, and of course, I tend to find this as the most interesting, is the ability for applications. So easy story, anything that authenticates against Active Directory, we can provide this, besides file shares, besides PowerShell, websites like vCenter, like your Hyper-V, your networking gear, anything that authenticates against Active Directory, we can see it, we can apply policy, and we can apply Yubikey as that second factor. So my last example is SQL itself. Pull up the application. Of course, this could be AD or it could be local, but doing Active Directory authentication. I hit connect. One last time, authenticate, touch my Yubikey, and I can get that access. So really simple in order to get Yubikeys in front of all these items. Really, it's just policy. And when we're talking about policy, it's very simple. I treat this very much like an ACL. All we need to do is understand exactly what we're trying to connect to. So I'll use my one example down here for PowerShell. Really, it's a policy for Active Directory. I can do this against Kerberos, NTLM, or LDAP. My policy type is static, meaning I always want to trigger this policy. Or it could be risk-based, saying if this user is perceived as risky, great, we can now apply MFA. And I'm applying this very broadly against my domain admins. Of course, I could apply this down to a single user, groups of users. And then my destination is specifically to my app server. But once again, we can be very flexible in how this is done. This might be applying for domain admins, touching any of my servers or any of my domain controllers. And my action here is MFA. So I bring up MFA, and my token of choice is FIDO, and I can choose exactly what that prompt is. So very easy for us to see all authentication in the environment, apply MFA, and in this case, apply MFA using Yubikeys. Now, one last thing I want to mention, obviously during the demo, I triggered MFA a bunch of times, and this could be considered a little bit too much. So under our advanced options, we can really choose exactly how often we're going to trigger. So maybe I only want MFA like every 60 minutes, every 4 hours, once a day. We can customize exactly what that end user experience is with MFA using Yubikeys as that strong second factor. With that, Evan, turn that over to you. Hopefully we have a couple questions.
Yeah, I'm checking the chat, actually. I don't see any questions. So if anybody does have any, please do let us know.
But if not, we can certainly give back a little bit of time as well. In fact, Evan, I will just stop sharing because I do believe you have one last slide.
Sure. Let me pull it back up. Can you see the summary key takeaways? Perfect. I see in the Q&A side, anonymous attendee says, is Silverfort license per user? Yes, so that's going to be based on human users, not by account, but yes, actual employees, like a live person.
Yeah, and Evan, I'll expand on that just for a second. And that's just because a single user, like a domain admin, can have their regular user along with their administrative user as well, or multiple administrative users. So it will be just against that single user. And of course, we could apply that single Yubikey against all those identities as well.
Perfect. I'm going to just submit this as an answer. Can Silverfort be used to enforce MFA on a RACF mainframe? RACF mainframe?
Yeah, so great question. So I would say generally not out of the box, because a lot of those, a lot of our mainframes that we come across don't have direct access into Active Directory. But I've seen a lot of great use cases through things like free IPA or other tools that can help bridge those into Active Directory. If the mainframe can communicate via a radius, we can also use radius as the bridge into Active Directory. Silverfort will act as the radius server and can use that to trigger MFA as well. So really great use case for taking some of those really legacy technologies, trigger radius, which then would trigger the Yubikey as that second factor.
Perfect. Thank you. Checking the questions. Does anybody have any other questions? I have a question. Chuck, how do you know so much about Yubikey?
That's a softball. I spent a couple of years over there. So as part of my authentication journey, spent a couple of years with CyberArk over to Yubikey. So now I get to talk about all the great technologies I've worked with over the years and combine them with Silverfort.
Awesome. Checking the questions, I don't see any others. And really, we have covered kind of all the content that we're going to cover here. If anybody does have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Really, anybody at Silverfort here can take that question and kind of bring it to the right party, or feel free to reach out to either Chuck or I directly. Our email addresses. Oh, we have one more. Two more, actually. Oh, just one, but thank you, Sandra. Tony Moat asked, can an MFA challenge be customized based on a specific privileged credential being passed in a script?
Yes, that is a great question. So yeah, so the very much like an ACL, the way we're going to trigger it is based off of variables such as the username, the source, the destination, or the protocol. So we can very easily say if this user is being triggered, we can do that. The other piece, taking it away from the MFA side of the house, when we're talking about trying to protect accounts that are non-interactive. So if this is non-interactive script, we can handle those in a different way to protect them without using MFA. And we can certainly take that conversation offline as well.
Tony, do you have a follow-up on that? If you want to just throw that in the Q&A, that's cool. Cool. Thanks, Tony. Yeah, thanks, Chuck. Okay, great. Doesn't look like there's any other questions. So we can wrap this up early, really just to cover kind of these key takeaways we have. And I'll wait a couple more seconds if anybody has any last minute questions here. Really, phishing-resistant MFA, it is a requirement by Executive Order 14028, effective by fiscal year 2024. Again, that's a federal government mandate for federal agencies. However, we do anticipate likely, there'll be kind of wider industry adoption just as a best practice. Just like NIST has kind of been adopted as a standard. Yubikey, one of our strong tech partners, provides very good, strong phishing-resistant MFA in compliance with the NIST standard for phishing-resistant MFA. And Silverfort can extend Yubikey to all human user on-premise Active Directory authentications. We did cover a couple of those edge cases like mainframes using Radius as well. Certainly there's a little more there, but just broad brushstrokes, absolutely it's something we can help put phishing-resistant MFA on top of. Thanks everybody for your time. Thanks Chuck for walking through this with us. This has been recorded, so we will post this publicly after the fact. So if you want to share this with anybody else, we'll send that link out to you as a follow-up. Again, if anybody has any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to either myself or Chuck. And thanks again for your time. Have a great rest of the week, everybody.